Right, we come to the first statement from the Secretary of State for Defence, John Healey.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on Ukraine, and I apologise for the delay in getting you and the front bench a copy of my statement. The responsibility is entirely mine. Mr. Speaker, I've just returned from 3 days of intense defence diplomacy. First, at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting in Brussels, where we welcomed President Zelensky, and then at the G7 Defence Ministers in Naples, where we had important updates from the battlefield, agreed this is a critical point in the conflict, and stressed the need to step up and speed up support for Ukraine. The G7 joint declaration strongly condemned Putin's illegal invasion and reinforced our unwavering support for Ukraine. It also rightly stated, Russia's aggression against Ukraine is posing a threat to international security, the purposes and principles of the United Nations, and the rules-based international order. This is what's at stake for us all. And if President Putin prevails in Ukraine, he will not stop at Ukraine. And if big nations redraw international boundaries by force, the sovereignty and security of all nations is undermined. That's why the UK support alongside allies is so important. Military, economic, industrial, diplomatic. But I can tell the House, Mr. Speaker, I've returned to the UK knowing that NATO is united for Ukraine, the G7 is united for Ukraine, just as the UK is united for Ukraine. And our job now is to turn these talks into action, which is exactly what we are doing as a government. So the Chancellor and I today are announcing that the UK will provide an additional £2.26 billion to Ukraine. Now this is new money which will be delivered under the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans to Ukraine scheme. That's part of the $50 billion loan package from G7 countries to support Ukraine's military, budget and reconstruction needs. Loans, Mr. Speaker, which will be repaid using the profits generated from immobilised Russian sovereign assets. Yeah. Profits on frozen Russian money supporting Ukraine's fight against Putin, turning the proceeds of Putin's corrupt regime against that regime and putting it in the hands of Ukrainians. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. Today's new money is additional to the £3 billion a year of military support this government has committed to Ukraine each year for as long as it takes. In addition to the £3.5 billion Defence Industrial Support Treaty, which I signed with Defence Minister Umerov in July, money that will be used by Ukraine to procure military equipment from British companies, boosting our British jobs and our British industry. And extra to the additional artillery, air defences, ammunition, missiles that we have announced and delivered in the first 4 months of this new government. Ukraine is a first-order priority for me as Defence Secretary. It's a first-order priority for this government. We will continue to step up support, we will continue to lead, and we'll continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Yeah. Now, Mr. Speaker, today is now day 973 since Putin launched his full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. 973 days, during which Ukrainians have been fighting with great courage, civilians and military alike. And there have been important battlefield developments in recent weeks. When I last updated the House, Ukrainian forces were 1 month into their remarkable offensive in Kursk. 3 months on, they continue to hold Russian territory, and Ukraine's strategic surprise has put Putin under pressure, forcing the diversion of some Russian troops and equipment. And despite the increase in brutal Russian counterattacks and aerial bombardments, they've so far failed to dislodge that Ukrainian incursion. And it's not just in Kursk where Ukraine is fighting back. Ukrainian forces have launched long-range attacks into Russian territory on military targets which are directly supporting Putin's illegal invasion. In September, Ukraine used long-range drones to attack 4 ammunition storage facilities, strikes which successfully destroyed thousands of tons of ammunition. And both the defensive thrust into Kursk and the strategic defensive strikes into Russia have had an impact on the battlefield. Russia's advance towards Pokrovsk in the east, Putin's main line of effort, has been slowed. Russian losses continue to rise. Since the start of the conflict, Russia has likely suffered 675,000 casualties. And in September, the average casualty rate each day of Russians on the battlefield in Ukraine was 1,271, a record high, 2.5 times the rate of this time last year. And on equipment, Mr. Speaker, they've now lost 3,400 tanks, 8,500 armoured vehicles, and 26 vessels in the Black Sea Fleet have been destroyed or damaged. But despite this incredible Ukrainian resilience, they remain under great pressure from Russian forces across multiple fronts. And Russian troops continue to advance and continue to attack Ukrainian infrastructure, targeting the important port of Odessa and striking energy infrastructure. So as we head into winter, Mr. Speaker, Ukraine's energy generation capacity has been reduced by up to 2/3 of that of pre-war levels. Russian industry remains on a war footing. Russian artillery is outfiring Ukraine at least 3-1. And Russia is also recruiting this year an additional 400,000 troops. Defence will account for 32%, 1/3 of the total government budget in Russia next year. And Mr. Speaker, in a concerning new development, it is now highly likely that the transfer of hundreds of combat troops from North Korea to Russia has begun. North Korean soldiers supporting Russia's war of aggression on European soil. It is as shocking as it is desperate. North Korea already sends significant munitions and arms to Russia in direct violation of multiple UN resolutions. And this developing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK has serious security implications for Europe and for the Indo-Pacific. It represents a wider growing alliance of aggression which NATO and the G7 nations must confront. Mr. Speaker, despite this dangerous development, Ukraine remains determined to fight on their front line in the east and in the territory in Kursk. President Zelensky will continue to seek support for his victory plan, and we want to see this plan succeed. We stand ready to work closely with the Ukrainians and with allies to help it succeed. And as we approach 1,000 days of this war, this conflict is now at a really critical moment. And that's why the UK continues to step up support for Ukraine. Ukrainians are fighting to regain their sovereign territory, but they are also fighting to protect the peace, the democracy, and the security for the rest of us in Europe.
James Cartledge, the Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I start by thanking the Secretary of State for advance side of his statement. May I offer my condolences and everyone on this side of the House to the family and friends of Corporal Christopher Gill, who we understand tragically lost his life during a training exercise recently. We understand he served this country for 13 years, including in Afghanistan, and more recently volunteered to train Ukrainian soldiers in the UK, having visited Salisbury Plain last May to see Operation Interflex, Mr. Speaker. We should be grateful to all of our service personnel, including Corporal Gill, who've played such a huge role training the Ukrainian armed forces. So they continue to fight and defend their homeland, a fight that goes on and one to which we continue to offer all support to the government, including in standing by the government, people and armed forces of Ukraine. As such, we warmly welcome the G7 joint declaration and funding announcement, but particularly share the government's concerns in relation to North Korea. Mr. Speaker, I have lost count of the many times Vladimir Putin has accused us and our allies of so-called escalatory action in our support for Ukraine. But today, we are considering the very real threat of North Korean combat troops being sent to support Russia's illegal invasion. Let us be in no doubt. Any potential agreement between Putin and Kim Jong-un to have North Korean boots on the ground in Ukraine at all, let alone in the numbers that have been reported, would be a major escalatory ratchet by Putin himself. After all, as the Secretary of State confirmed, Russia has already procured munitions and ballistic missiles from North Korea. Not only was the transfer of those weapons in the first place completely unacceptable, but a blatant violation of UN sanctions that Russia itself voted for. Both the transfer of North Korean weapons and now the threat of combat troops belies weakness and desperation, as the Secretary of State said, not strength on Putin's part. And above all, it begs the question of what he is offering North Korea in return. But we should not be deterred and must respond. We took decisive countermeasures to help constrain the transfer of weapons between North Korea and Russia. The Conservative government imposed sanctions on the arms for oil trade between Russia and North Korea, including asset freezes, travel bans and transport sanctions, and the new government in turn must now respond to this latest threat of combat troops. Can I press the Minister to look at how the UK should respond in the round? Yes, we need to look at the diplomatic tools we can use to disrupt cooperation between North Korea and Russia. But we also need to urgently look again both at our military aid to Ukraine and the freedom we offer them in terms of using the munitions we supply, particularly long-range missiles, Mr. Speaker. As such, and given the continued need to keep providing further capability to Ukraine, we welcome yesterday's announcement that the UK will contribute £2.6 billion to the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan Scheme. We were a vocal advocate for mobilising frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine and strongly welcome the additional funding. Can I ask him, when will the money be made available to Ukraine and over what term? The sooner these funds are mobilised, the better. So when exactly will Ukraine receive the funding? Finally, Mr. Speaker, we have spoken many times of the reality that we are not just facing Russian aggression, but a broader authoritarian axis that ultimately threatens the UK. We've seen this explicitly in terms of Iran and the Red Sea, and now we see it coming ever closer to home with the prospect of North Korean troops deploying in a European theatre of war. Surely this strengthens even further the argument that the government needs to deliver on its supposed cast iron guarantee to spend 2.5% on defence. So given that the Secretary of State failed to answer me in defence orals, can I once again press him to confirm that he is fighting hard with the Treasury to deliver a clear pathway to 2.5% in the budget at the end of this month?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for his comments about Corporal Gill, and I will pass those on to his widow and make sure his family is aware of that and the sentiments of the whole House. He's right about the enormous contribution that Corporal Gill made, including to the Interflex training programme, and that's a programme I was proud to be able to commit to extending throughout 2025. It's a programme that the Chancellor and I together visited on Sunday, where we met Colonel Boardman, the commander of Operation Interflex, and we met the officers and soldiers, Mr. Speaker, of Three Scots, together with instructors from Kosovo, Australia and Sweden, illustrating the way that the UK is leading a multinational effort to support Ukrainian soldiers. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is right, and I suspect there is unanimity in this House of concern about the developments in Russia and the growing alliance with North Korea, united in its determination to take the action required to respond to that, and united in recognising that we must do so alongside NATO and other G7 allies. He asks me about the new funds, the loan funds available for Ukraine through the proceeds of the interest on frozen Russian assets. We expect those to be available and in the Ukraine hands from early in the new year, which will make the UK ahead of many other nations participating in this scheme in doing so. And finally, Mr. Speaker, on 2.5%, we remain totally committed to spending 2.5% on defence. We must do this to meet the threats this country faces. The Prime Minister confirmed that commitment to set out a clear path to 2.5% in our first week in government at the NATO summit in Washington. And I just say to him gently again, the last time this country spent 2.5% on defence was in 2010 with a Labour government. a level that has never been matched in any of the 14 Conservative years since.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tamranjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the announcement today of the UK's increased support for funding for Ukraine as part of the ERA loan scheme. And the Secretary of State spoke about what is at stake for us all. But can he speak more about what discussions he had with his counterparts at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting about the need for them to substantially increase their support? And further to our Prime Minister's recent meeting with the US President, what update is there on the usage of Storm Shadow missiles by Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, can I first welcome the new chair of the Select Committee, who I believe now has a committee to chair, and I look forward to an invitation, I hope, to give evidence and to discuss with them soon. Mr. Speaker, at the NATO Defence Ministers, there was unanimity amongst 32 nations that the important commitments that NATO nations made in Washington, particularly to the $40 billion of extra support for Ukraine, must be delivered. There was a recognition too that pledges made must be pledges delivered. And one of the striking concerns that the Ukrainians have is that a third of the equipment and support pledged has so far been delivered. So there was a determination to step up, not just what we can provide, but how quickly we can provide it, something that as a new government we did from day one. And Mr. Speaker, on Storm Shadow, only Putin benefits from a discussion about this. There is no single weapon that has turned the tide of any war, and whether it is artillery, ammunition, armoured vehicles or missiles, the UK provides support to Ukraine to pursue its UN right to defend its territory and its people.
We come to Liberal Democrat spokesperson Helen Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement. Liberal Democrats welcome the new measures announced today to use the profits of frozen assets for Ukraine. That $2 billion will be of immense value to our Ukrainian allies as they seek to repel Putin's illegal invasion. Not least following the alarming news that 1,500 North Korean troops are currently being trained in Russia to fight in Ukraine. But we must go further, faster. Russia must not and cannot succeed. There remains $22 billion of frozen assets locked up in our country. We urge the government, as we have done for years, to seize these assets and repurpose them for Ukraine right away. Will the Minister commit to doing so? Is he having conversations with our democratic partners to this effect? And with the US elections fast approaching, it's deeply worrying that our commitment to our Ukrainian allies is uncertain. A second Trump presidency could have a devastating effect on the security of Europe and of Ukraine. So we urge the government, seize these assets now so that we can support Ukraine come what may. We must lead with Europe on this. EU countries have between them close to $20 billion worth of frozen assets. Will the Minister consider convening an urgent summit with European counterparts to begin that process? And does he agree that if the US cannot, then Europe must?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say to the honourable gentleman, lady, that in fairness to the party opposite, when they were in government, and her party before the election, as we did, we were united in the efforts to try and get the interest drawn down from the frozen Russian assets put in Ukrainian hands. And the UK government, before the last election and since, has been leading this work. This is practical steps we can take now. Whatever the declaratory position she wants to adopt about seizing Russian assets, this is valuable additional funding that from the new year will be in the hands of the Ukrainian government to be able to spend, in the UK's case, on the military aid that they need. This is in addition to all the other increase that we've put in place since the election. And just say to her, I hope, despite her calls for going very much further, she'll recognise how significant this move is. She'll recognise that the UK is amongst the first of the nations to move on this, and that she will give this House the full support when we introduce the primary legislation that will seek the Parliamentary Spending Authority to provide this financial assistance in pursuant of a bilateral agreement that will strike with Ukraine over how to do it. Thank you.
Emma Lulber.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When this government said our support for Ukraine was absolute, we meant it. My right honourable friend referred to the recently signed Defence Export Treaty between the UK and Ukraine, which will support Ukraine's defence industrial base whilst helping to replenish our own stockpiles. As far as he is able, can he update the House on the treaty's progress?
Seriously.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I was proud to sign that treaty. It is a treaty that means the Ukraine can draw down the export credit cover. It can contract with UK companies. And it's a framework also, Mr. Speaker, like some of the other frameworks the UK has put in place that other nations and the companies of other nations can use in order to deal with the difficulties that many face in contracting with Ukraine. It will be used by the Ukrainians for the contracting and the procurement of munitions, for ammunition. It will allow us not just to step up the provision of military aid support to Ukraine, but the production of essential military aid to Ukraine as well.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the statement, but the BBC are reporting that the money will be paid not in one go, but in tranches over time. We have the budget next week. Can the Secretary of State absolutely assure us that, as this is what accountants would call an exceptional item, this money will in no way be included in the overall defence budget next week and will in no way be attempted to bolster or bump that up, because there are rumours there will actually be cuts? Can you just give us that assurance this is a one-off and it will be treated completely differently in the Red Book?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I can give the right honourable gentleman that assurance. This is a one-off. It is additional. It is separate. It will be accounted for and set out separately in the Treasury documentation. Its significance is that it is a loan to Ukraine that Ukraine will not have to pay back, because it's the interest on the frozen Russian assets that will service that loan. And he asks at the beginning of his question, why not this paid all in one go? This will be made available soon in the new year. The Ukrainians will be able to draw it down as they need it for the purposes that they decide they need it for.
Derek Twig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's comments that he says that in terms of North Korea and the growing alliance of aggression needs to be confronted, and I hope we have a strong response to that. But can I also welcome the 2.2 billion extra? But he makes a very important point during his statement, one of many, which was that the Ukrainians have been outgunned 3-1 in artillery by the Russians. So, of course, while the additional support is vital, how quickly can we ensure we get extra munitions, artillery and missiles from the alliance, from the G7 and that across to Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
We can get it into the hands of Ukrainians just as soon as it's available for that purpose. And it's one of the reasons, for instance, when I announced the new contract in the UK to produce the short-range air defence missiles, the LMMs, initial contract of 650. They will be in the hands of Ukrainians from the beginning of next year, and we hope to step that up during the course of 2025. Likewise, where other nations are ready to make available the weaponry and the ammunition that Ukrainians need, the established arrangements for getting it in the hands of Ukrainians is in place. It's not a question of how, it's a question of how quickly.
Sir Julian.
The delicious irony of the interest on Kremlin kleptocrats' ill-gotten gains being used to fund the resistance against Russian aggression will not be lost on members in all parts of this House, and I welcome in entirety what the Defence Secretary has said. He will know better than any of us the crucial importance of the NATO alliance machinery in the assistance of Ukrainian resistance. And given that one recent ex-American president and one current French president have both made disobliging remarks about the NATO alliance in the fairly recent past, can he reassure us that at least in the case of President Macron, he is now fully on board the alliance and France's important contribution to it?
Mr. Speaker, I can indeed. At no point during the 2 days of NATO defence ministers' talks was there any indication of the sort of views that he suggests may be held by some in America or previously might have been expressed by President Macron. And indeed, in the very good bilateral meeting that I had with the French Defence Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, it is quite clear that the French commitment to support Ukraine is as strong as the UK commitment, and I'm glad to say the determination of the French to work with us more closely on security and defence is also equally strong.
Kelvin Bailey.
I welcome the statement today and the announcement of further funding. And in order to ensure that we sustain the pace and level of support that we're providing aid to the Ukraine, and to ensure that we energise our own logistical enterprise, may I ask my right honourable friend what action he has taken to boost UK defence industrial production to support both Ukrainian armed forces and our own defence supply chains across the whole of the UK?
State.
Well, my honourable friend knows this territory probably as well as anybody else in this House, Mr. Speaker, and he will know that over the 973 days, one of the things that the UK government has done is to change fundamentally the way that we go about procuring what's required. And industry, British industry, has responded magnificently to that, being able to respond quicker, innovate more rapidly, and to devise what they can produce to meet the needs that Ukraine says they have on the front line. Our task in UK government is to be the middleman, if you like, to make sure that that can happen. It can happen at greater volumes and it can happen at greater speed, and we'll continue to do that.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the government think that Ukraine is winning or losing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if he was listening to my statement, but I made very clear that this is a critical period in the conflict. Ukraine is under huge pressure, especially on the Eastern Front, but it is fighting, it is counter-offensing, it is putting Putin under pressure as well. And the only conclusion that the 32 nations drew from the discussions in Brussels, the confirmation of the G7 nations in Naples, was that now is the moment where Ukraine's allies must step up the support that we can provide, put Ukraine in the strongest possible position to withstand the Russian onslaught, and to be able to put pressure also on Putin. Military, economic, diplomatic.
Cartettles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the statement today from the Secretary of State. It's really good news for Ukraine. Would he agree with me that Ukraine is the frontier of war with Kremlin, and international support is more critical than ever before, and we must be absolutely clear that the defence of the UK begins in Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is right, and her very words were repeated by a number of defence ministers in Brussels. Defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. Defence of Europe starts in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for the same values, and Ukraine is also fighting for the rest of us in Europe.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, in sharp contrast to the President's of the Secretary General of the United Nations at Putin's summit in Russia, which sends out all the wrong signals. The Secretary of State's statement this morning is hugely welcome. Thank you. But in further to the question raised by the Chairman of the Select Committee, is it really not time that not only Storm Shadow, but that all the material being supplied to Ukraine by the Western Alliance should be used by Ukraine in the manner that they most see fit?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we provide Ukraine with the weaponry and the support to defend its country, to defend its freedom, to defend its people. And there is a consistency in that, and there is no bar in them striking Russian targets, military targets, as long as it's consistent with international humanitarian law and it's part of the defence, the proper defence of their country. And I spoke about the long-range drones and the successful attacks that they have been making. Defensive attacks, but nevertheless on military targets in Russia. It is for the Ukrainians to determine how best to defend their country, and we will support them in whatever ways that we can.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I warmly welcome this £2.26 billion of aid announced today. It's a great news for those fighting for democracy in Europe and a day of low morale in the Kremlin. It's fantastic. Can I ask, and considering that what the Ukrainians might well use some of this money for is to continue innovating at pace, they're creating new technologies to fight against Putin every few weeks at the moment, they're cutting edge, they're adaptive. Can I ask the Secretary of State, are we going to learn from our friends in Ukraine and make sure that we as a country are investing in our own defence SMEs so that we can have the same output in the future? Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while there's been no change in the basis on which we provide military aid to Ukraine, there is a change in the approach that we take, not just to providing aid, but to producing some of the military equipment and ammunition. And what our challenge now is to take the lessons of what we've demonstrated can be done to support Ukraine in order to be able to equip our own forces better to fight in the future.
Dave Dougan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement, its content and advance sight of it. The additional funding for Ukraine is, of course, very welcome, but it's what material they turn that into which will have the effect on the battlefield that we wish to see. With the shell production of our European partners still well short of 1 million units per year, can the Secretary of State, as far as possible, indicate how UK shell production has grown, either in numeric or percentage terms? And if he can't share that with the House, can he give us an assurance that it is increasing? Thank you.
State.
Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely give him the assurance it's increasing. And I've already spoken about the short-range air defence missiles, the LMMs, which is increasing, particularly to meet what the Ukrainians need. And they're very clear. It is air defence systems, it's long-range drones, it's the things that matter most, both for their defence and their ability to put Russia properly under pressure as well.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome today's announcement of an additional £2.2 billion financial support for Ukraine generated by frozen Russian assets. Can my right honourable friend say a little more about this concerning development of North Korean soldiers supporting Russia's war of aggression on European soil, and how that underlines the importance of us using every tool in our box to support Ukraine's efforts?
So State.
Mr. Speaker, I regret to say to my honourable friend, I'm not in a position to give the House any more details of this. First to say, we are watching this extremely closely, monitoring it extremely closely, but we and the House has detected this growing cooperation between North Korea and Russia, growing cooperation between Iran and Russia, at least over the last 12 months. It's a sign not of strength but of weakness on Putin's part, but it does introduce a dangerous new development both to Ukraine and to wider European security.
Mark Pritchard.
I welcome the Defence Secretary's recognition of President Zelensky's victory plan and his support for that, but he will know that part of that plan is the use of long-range missiles. And I get his point about long-range drones, UK drones, being used for military targets only in Russia and within the norms of international rules of law. I also detect, perhaps, with two questions on long-range missiles, these edging towards a position where he might publicly declare that Ukraine can have the freedom to hit targets in Russia, military targets, using long-range missiles. That will change the war. That will have an impact.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, we step up the support we provide to Ukraine, but there's been no change in the basis on which we provide that support to Ukraine.
Clive Betts.
Speaker, could I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and also thank him for the amount of personal commitment he's clearly making to this subject. It's obviously very expensive for Putin to fight this war, but he's gaining a lot of this money from the sale of oil. There are real concerns that there are British firms or firms with British connections who are facilitating and enabling the illegal oil trade to go on. So what more can be done in cooperation with his friend, the Foreign Secretary, to ensure that sanctions are more effective against the Russian oil trade?
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend is right. It isn't just that we can confirm today making this additional loan money available for the Ukrainians. It's also important to remember that the sanctions themselves are responsible for freezing at least $400 billion of money otherwise that Russia will be able to use to feed its war machine. And wherever there is evidence of sanctions busting, including some of the steps that have been taken by this UK government and others on the shadow fleet. In other words, the shipping that is in the grey zone trying to avoid sanctions. Wherever we have the evidence required to act and to sanction, we will do that and will continue to do that.
Sir Blatham.
Not only is a full battalion of North Korean soldiers set to be deployed to assist Russia in Ukraine, but Putin is also benefiting from components and weapons provided by the Iranians and the Chinese. This all represents an unprecedented conflation of threats to global security. So I echo the question put by my friend, the Shadow Defence Secretary. The commitment to investing 2.5% of GDP is the right one, but when will it be backed up with action?
Well, the right honourable lady is right. We totally condemn North Korea's involvement and support for Russia, from arms transfer to any further developments. And as I said in my statement, this is in breach of multiple UN resolutions and will continue to watch that.
Phil Bricknell.
Mr. Speaker, will the Secretary of State join me in paying tribute to UK armed forces who are providing vital support to our Ukrainian allies, but also to the Ukrainian armed forces that are fighting valiantly against Putin's unlawful invasion of Ukraine?
I will indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I've had the privilege of visiting Interflex training courses, I think 4 times now. I visited the second ever course at Salisbury Plain. It is deeply moving both to see the level of commitment of British forces to the task of training Ukrainians and to spend time with those Ukrainian recruits, men who are lorry drivers, bank clerks, PR executives of all ages who have volunteered to fight for their country and their freedom, trained by British forces, now with other countries alongside them, equipping them to be able to fight for their country, but knowing that they will return to their own nation, they will return and they will return soon to the front line is deeply sobering.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
I very much welcome this £2.26 billion, but has the Defence Secretary had an opportunity to study the National Audit Office report published last month into the impact of our operations in Ukraine, in particular on that Operation Interflex has had on the availability of the defence estate for the training of units of the British Army. And whilst that's acceptable in the short term, in the long term it probably is not. What impact assessment has he carried out, and what proposals does he have to make available the defence estate we need to train British soldiers?
Secretary of State.
Well, nothing will shake our commitment to continuing the Interflex training programme. We've determined and we will continue that throughout 2025. And those partner countries that have been alongside us this year, many are now already committed to doing so next year. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the... forgive me, he asked me about Interflex, and he asked me about the defence estate, and he asked me about the training of Ukrainian soldiers. That will continue. And in terms of the National Audit Office report, which is where he started, I have indeed read that report. It is a welcome change from the normal run that we've been used to in recent years of National Audit Office reports into the Ministry of Defence. And it praises a good deal of what has been done by the Ministry of Defence in support of Ukraine, and it's very welcome.
Graham Downey.
Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State for a very welcome statement indeed. In that statement, he mentioned the importance of Ukrainian forces' efforts in the Black Sea against the Russian Black Sea Fleet and how important that is to the Ukrainian economy. Can he perhaps go a little bit further and describe how this funding with Ukraine will actually help them to ensure that security and perhaps even go further in the Black Sea? Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the principle of this funding is that we put it in the hands of Ukrainians. Ukrainians are in the best position and must be in the position to decide how best to use it. We have said they can use it entirely if they choose for military support, and the support that they choose to procure with it will be a matter for them in discussion with us.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is the Defence Secretary able to share with us any conversations that the Foreign Secretary had whilst in China about China's engagement in this situation, and particularly their willingness to bring the influence that they undoubtedly have on both Russia and North Korea to bear?
Secretary of State.
Happily I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. So the Foreign Secretary was in China on the 18th and 19th of October. He met with his counterpart, the Foreign Minister, and he did indeed talk about the areas in which our countries may disagree, including on Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, and he talked also and raised the UK's concerns over China's supply of equipment to Russia and to Russia's military-industrial complex.
Kevin Benavia.
Deputy Speaker, I also very much welcome today's statement from our right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. It's evidence not just of warm words, but of real practical support for our ally in its desperate hour of need. But this country cannot do this on its own. Can my right honourable friend update this House on any discussions that he or his ministerial colleagues have had with our friends in the rest of the G7 in combating Putin through economic measures?
Secretary of State.
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I came away from Naples from the G7. I came away from Brussels for the NATO defence ministers, reinforced of the view that there is a determination not just to stand with Ukraine now, but to do so for as long as it takes. And I will send my honourable friend a copy of the communiqué from both, in which I think he will be encouraged, as I was, by the degree of unanimity and determination, not to allow Putin to believe that if he holds out, the West will give up.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the announcement of the acceleration loans, but also welcome the timing. The British government is not simply waiting to see the outcome of the US presidential election in the way that some governments are doing at this time. Will the Defence Secretary repeat the assurance that he gave the House last week namely that European NATO nations can assure Ukraine that, regardless of US policy, military aid to Ukraine will not decrease next year?
Secretary of State.
On the contrary, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're determined to maintain and step up from the UK the military aid required. There is a similar determination I found from defence ministers across the NATO nations, and we recognise that this is a fight the Ukrainians are mounting for themselves, but they are also waging on behalf of us all and the values that we share with them.
Tarkil Crichton.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for this additional 2.26 billion for Ukraine, which will find a strong echo amongst the hundreds and thousands of individuals across this country who've opened their doors to Ukrainian refugees, and the works of charities and organisations like Jeeps for Peace in Scotland, which sends direct aid by taking pickups across Europe to the front line. And doesn't this money and the individual support of Britain show that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful for his thanks. Those thanks should really go to the Chancellor, because it's the Treasury that has led the way on ensuring that we can put in place this new system of loans and make this money additionally available to Ukraine. But he's completely right to say part of the strength of the support that we can offer as a country to Ukraine rests on the strength of the support of the British people, the warmth of which they've shown from the outset for Ukrainian refugees, and also the determination of many groups. He cites one that have been willing to collect and in some cases transport support for Ukraine and Ukrainians out to the country itself, and I pay tribute to their efforts.
Ben Opsijekti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is concerning that we only received the briefest of updates in this House on the direct involvement of North Korean troops after a week of this being widely reported in the media. Last week, during defence questions, the Right Honourable Gentleman gave his full-throated support for Ukraine, but made no mention of the government's awareness of North Korean reinforcements potentially being deployed in up to brigade strength. So what is the government's current assessment of the scope of North Korean involvement, and how do overt North Korean boots on the ground in Ukraine necessitate a change in our posture?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've just given the House the assessment of the involvement and the extent at present of North Korean troops.
Blair McDougall.
The North Korean boots potentially joining on the ground, the Iranian drones in the air above Ukraine. It seems clear now that the calculus that Russia is operating to is very different from that of the Western alliance. And I wonder if the Secretary of State agrees with me that there's a risk that when the fear of escalation is one-sided, that itself becomes escalatory. And so while welcoming the additional support that's announced today, I wonder if you'll join me in saying it's time for other countries to follow the lead that the UK has shown today.
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, wherever there is signs of breaching UN resolutions, of breaching sanctions and of dangerous escalation in support of Russia, we will act. We have acted before. And he is right to point to the growing alliance that we see between Russia and Iran and between Russia and North Korea.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank very much the Secretary of State for his statement and indeed for his very, very welcome news. Everybody in this House is pleased and indeed incredibly pleased at the decision by our government and by our Minister to do that. Thank you very much. I'm just a bit conscious of the US elections. I want to ask a question if I can in relation to that. As the US election draws closer and the uncertainty of the level of support that will come from the US post-election, does the Secretary of State agree that there must be caution? I say this very, very respectfully of any minister or indeed anyone in this House expressing an opinion on that presidential race. But will the Secretary of State take the opportunity to reaffirm the strong, resilient view of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to stand against Russian aggression, to support those who need our help through aid, through weaponry and through diplomacy? Thank you so much.
State.
I think the Honourable Gentleman is right, quite clearly. The US elections are for the US people. As a UK government and as a UK Parliament, we will deal with whoever the American people choose to elect as their president. He is right, however. I'm glad he welcomes the support that as a government we've stepped up for Ukraine. But I'd say to him and to the House, and the honourable gentleman opposite, who is the Shadow Defence Secretary, I think will recognise this. It makes the job of the UK government so much easier to provide this support when there is such united support in this House for what we must do to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
Tim Rocker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome the statement today from my right honourable friend. I wouldn't expect him to comment, as he said before, on the US presidential election, but naturally there is a nervousness of policy of a future US government, which makes what European partners and allies do even more important. And there is a huge disparity between the aid being provided by different partners across Europe. Denmark has been phenomenal in providing 1.86% of GDP, or over €6 billion. Other countries, such as Spain, not so much. Can he assure us that there were robust discussions in private amongst his defence minister colleagues in Brussels?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I can. There were those discussions, and those discussions were about the level of commitment we must make collectively to Ukraine, and the level of commitment we must make collectively to NATO itself. And I welcome the fact that this year 23 of the 32 NATO nations will meet that 2% of GDP threshold. It has to be a bare minimum. There is more that we will need to do, particularly as European nations within NATO in the years ahead.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I warmly thank the Secretary of State and the full ministerial team for their hard work on mobilising this additional money from frozen Russian sovereign assets, and I do hope other countries will follow UK leadership on this. In mobilising every tool across the government, and with winter approaching, could I also ask the Secretary of State to continue the push to realise the assets from the sale of Chelsea Football Club, the £2.5 billion from Roman Abramovich that could go towards humanitarian needs, which are also increasingly urgent in Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Yes, indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government sees the case that he makes, and my honourable friend, the Foreign Minister, in fact met, I believe, my honourable friend last night to discuss this further.
Gordon McKee.
On a visit to Kyiv with parliamentary colleagues last month, we saw firsthand the incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people, who I know will welcome this afternoon's statement. But unfortunately, Russia's war machine continues to be powered by Western-made semiconductors that are smuggled into the country. So can I ask the Secretary of State what work the government is doing to make sure that Russia does not get access to this technology?
Secretary of State.
One of the great assets of this government is my honourable friend, the Foreign Minister. And he's a great asset to this government and this House because of the work that he does with so many other countries. And wherever there is discussions that are required or evidence that's gathered, my honourable friend is speaking to a lot of the countries who may find that they have within their own country companies that could be involved in those supply chains. Wherever that happens, my honourable friend is on it, and he's leading the charge to make sure that where we can identify those supply chains, we take the action that's necessary to close them down.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his very welcome statement. As we approach 1,000 days since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, it's increasingly clear that Ukraine's survival is dependent on West increasing our manufacture of munitions. Can you say a little bit more about boosting our defence industrial supply chains, including those in the West Midlands, where defence manufacturers are very keen to contribute?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend is right. The importance of the British defence industry isn't just in the greater security that gives us as a nation, it's part of the economic boost that will drive growth in the future. And one of the features I was so pleased to see at the recent Government Investment Summit was the confirmation that defence would be one of the 8 economic growth sectors which would receive the priority policy, focus and support as we develop that for the future. This is in the interests of Ukraine immediately. It's in our own interests in the future. It's the way that we can combine both the strengthening of our national security and the boost to our national economy.
I'll now give the front benches a few moments to change over before we start on the second statements.